It's buffering right now. Yes, we have started recording. Yes.
Right. Hello, everybody, to our next iteration of the Citing Vulnerability series. Today's is an unusual topic and an unusual speaker. Uh, Over the last few lectures, we have looked at various aspects of vulnerability, but today we were looking at vulnerable languages, texts that have not been, so to say, visible, languages that are forgotten more or less in many cases, even in language and humanities departments. Professor Charles Hallisey and his translation of texts in the Buddhist canon, and teacher in the Divinity School of Harvard is our speaker for today. We are very grateful to a suitable agency for arranging this. Their representative, Smriti Khanna Mehra, is here this evening. We are extremely grateful to Professor Charles Hallisey, who, as you can imagine, has an early hour talk, given the time difference from Harvard and us. And welcome to all of you. And I will hand this over to Atul and or Meenakshi. Those of you who have not been part of the series so far, we have had people speaking on Gothic vulnerability and things, and we have a couple of more others who will be speaking over the next two sessions. So thank you all for coming in, and over to you, Atul.
Thank you, sir, and welcome once again, Professor Charles Hallisey. And if I may introduce the speaker for today, Charles Hallisey is the Yehan Numata Senior Lecturer in Buddhist Literatures at Harvard Divinity School, where he teaches Buddhist scriptures and Buddhist ethics, as well as Pali language and literature. His research centers on Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka and literature in Buddhist culture. His most recent book is Therigatha, Poems of the First Buddhist Women, published by the Harvard University Press in 2015. He is currently working on a book project entitled Flowers on the Tree of Poetry, The Moral Economy of Literature in Buddhist Sri Lanka. His talk today is titled Vulnerable Languages and Forgotten Texts. Over to you, Professor Hallisey.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone for attending and also just express my kind of wonder that we can be together digitally and with me in the United States and the rest of you in India. It's one of the resources of technology that I think we learned how to take advantage of during the pandemic when all of us were forced to do things remotely. But I'm very happy that even after the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic have eased somewhat, that we continue to use the benefits or the resources of technology like we're using today. So the Pali language is the vulnerable language that I will speak about today. And I want to begin by just saying a few words about what is Pali. So popularly, Pali is generally thought of as the language that the historical Buddha spoke in. There's something that we can say that there seems to be some kind of good historical basis for thinking this. And what we might say is that what the language that the historical Buddha spoke in was a language that would be similar to what the saints in medieval India used, that is known as Sant Bhasha, a language that would be understandable to people who spoke a variety of linked languages. A European analogy might be that someone who knows Italian can understand what someone speaking in Spanish is communicating, even if they can't speak Spanish, but they understand that. And so what we probably can imagine is that the historical Buddha, who lived in around the 5th century or the 4th century before the Common Era, that he cultivated an ability to teach in a language that was understandable to people who spoke a variety of local or Deshi languages in North India at the time. But historically, the Pali language is something far more than just the language that the historical Buddha spoke. And what it developed into is a language that functioned more the way that Sanskrit functioned in India and then across South Asia, Sri Lanka, and Burma, and then the rest of Southeast Asia as well. In the sense that it's more like Sanskrit than a spoken language, what we emphasize is that it's clear that the Pali is a constructed language, a language that's made out of a variety of different spoken languages. People who specialize in historical linguistics can identify that there's grammatical features in Pali that seem like the local languages of Northeast India, while there are other grammatical features that seem more like the local languages of Northwest India at the time. You can also say that, like Sanskrit as a language, Pali was improved, that it was cultivated, and its grammar was standardized in ways that local spoken languages were not. It very quickly became, like Sanskrit, a cosmopolitan or translocal language. So it was a language not that anyone had as their mother tongue, but a language that people learned as a second language. And the purpose of learning it was to be able to use a language that was understood and used for a variety of expressive purposes in a whole lot of different regions. In this sense, that Pali functioned something like what scholars sometimes call a church language, that it was a language that was used for a limited number of purposes, that it was very sophisticated in the vocabulary that it had for those purposes, but for the vocabulary of everyday life, like agriculture or cooking, Pali was relatively impoverished. That is to say, you couldn't write a cookbook in Pali that would tell you how to cook various kinds of meals. But for abstract scholastic vocabulary, it's particularly rich in this, and it kept on enriching itself by turning to vocabulary that it drew from other languages, and in particular Sanskrit. The other thing that we can say about Pali as a translocal language is that it unified a particular kind of religious world, because Pali was limited to its use to the world of Theravada Buddhism, and which historically would have included South India, particularly the city of Kanchipuram and Tamil Nadu, then Sri Lanka, Burma, Southeast Asia, of all the countries of Southeast Asia, then in the modern times, Nepal, and then wherever Theravada Buddhism has spread. The final thing to add about Pali historically is that it functions something as a prestige language. And so that the ability to express oneself in Pali, to understand Pali, to use Pali, was not only valuable for religious purposes, but it gave prestige and status to anyone who was competent in the use of the language. In modern times, however, we can say that Pali has moved into a status that we could say it definitely is a vulnerable language. That is to say that it's not like what sometimes people refer to as endangered languages or vanishing languages, such as the spoken languages of indigenous groups that fall out of use, but that changes of the world the cultural world that valued Pali means that the use of Pali has changed over time into different kinds of states of vulnerability. One of the things that has affected very dramatically the use of Pali in the Theravada Buddhist world is a modern kind of emphasis on canonical texts of Buddhism, rather than the full range of texts that were written historically in Pali. So that modern Buddhists tend to emphasize that what they're most interested in is what they refer to as what the Buddha taught. And they tend to put into a secondary status the commentaries, the sub-commentaries, the auxiliary grammatical works, all the things connected to the understanding of the Pali Canon. In the past, probably no one would have ever dreamed to read the Pali text from the Pali Canon, that is the texts that are the preservation of what is remembered as what the Buddha taught, that no one would have ever thought of just going directly to a canonical text. Almost always they would have read any canonical text through making use of a whole variety of commentaries on those texts. But today, for the most part, most people learning Pali, particularly Buddhist monks, emphasize in their studies only canonical texts, such that the subsequent 2,000-year history of writing in Pali has become really quite neglected, and many texts, we could say, are, for all intents and purposes, forgotten, that they exist only in very fragile manuscripts and have not even been converted into printed text, much less into texts that are available on the internet. The other thing that we can say about Pali is that what has changed in the world that used it historically is that it has taken a second place to English as the translocal language. So that Buddhist thinkers, Buddhist monks who are working in Pali, working on Pali canonical texts, reading them, interpreting them, valuing them, would probably speak to each other across language boundaries. A monk from Thailand to someone in Sri Lanka, or a monk in Sri Lanka to someone in Nepal, that they probably would use English instead of Pali itself. And the last thing to just say about the vulnerability that has happened about Pali as a language is that the institutions that support the teaching of Pali are gradually becoming fewer and fewer. And this is true not only in the Theravada Buddhist world, where monks and ordained women are studying Pali in religious institutions like monasteries, where the opportunity to study Pali to advanced levels are becoming fewer and fewer, but also that the study of Pali in modern universities across Asia, particularly in India, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, but also in European and North American universities, is becoming, the opportunities to study Pali are becoming fewer and fewer. Those of us working in North American universities and European universities speak about a crisis of Pali study. What is happening almost routinely is that when someone retires from their position that was dedicated to the study of Pali, the teaching of Pali, those people are not replaced. And as a result, no one is able to study Pali to an advanced level, which means even if people wanted to appoint someone to teach Pali in contemporary university, they would be hard-pressed to find someone who would be fully competent to do so. Just to make the point is that this is true not only in places like North America and Europe, where Pali tends to be an academic subject. It's also true of universities in India, where the study of Pali is universities that teach Pali are becoming fewer and fewer. And then also in Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka and Thailand and Burma, where the study of Pali is not emphasized to the degree that it used to be. For the purposes of the program like the Vulnerability Chair at the University of Hyderabad, say, oh, there's something to lament about the decline of attention to Pali literature, because historically the heritage of Pali may provide a lot of materials that are particularly relevant to the concerns of the vulnerability studies program at the University of Hyderabad. The reason for this is a historical one. That the German English scholar who has now passed away, Friedhelm Hardy, made the observation that I've always thought is particularly insightful, in that he said that in Pali Buddhist literature, what we see is reflected in the text is some attention to the presence of everyday life and everyday religion and ritual that is greater than what we see in, say, Brahmanical texts, other Sanskrit texts. So that in a certain kind of important way, Buddhist writers, Buddhists who are writing in Pali, were oftentimes much closer to everyday life historically. And so that when they are giving it, say, telling a story or giving an account of something that happened, oftentimes there are details in the backgrounds of these stories that help us to kind of see something of the reality of the vulnerability of people in the past. In particular, what you see, the everyday vulnerability of people in subsistence economies, where even having access to adequate food, adequate nutrition could not be taken for granted. So one example to just show you what I'm referring to, there's one story that is in Pali that is just telling something that is happening between a person who is relatively well off, and then also that person's servant, in which the boss or the relatively well off person gives some food to the servant, and which the kind of food is specified. It's some kind of muffin or a small cake that's made out of the husk of rice. So that instead of having food that comes from rice that normally would be cooked after it has been husked and thus is edible in that way, that what for the wealthy and the well-off, the byproducts of husking rice, the outer husk that would be thrown away and not eaten for them, impoverished people would use those things to cook and eat that kind of food. But in addition to just giving us information about how it is that impoverished people in subsistence economies were getting by, the story narrator tells us a detail about what we could say the social life of impoverished people at the time that he was telling the story, in which he makes the observation that poor people don't like to eat in front of people who have more money than they do. And so that the servant, when they were given this cake made out of rice husk, went off by herself to eat alone. And so that idea of something about how the social life of a community in a subsistence economy, in which some people had a bit more than other people, but the people who were just really trying to get by, that they had their own forms of behavior, their own senses of etiquette, their own senses of how other people perceive them, that was kind of recognizable in the way that they behaved in everyday life. This is one of the things that I've observed during my time living in Sri Lanka over the last now 40 years, where you could see that poor people who are oftentimes given food by people who are a bit more well off, have something to spare, and are also generous, that poor people may take the food and go to a place where they're not immediately seen by other people when they're eating. This sense of the vulnerability of people in a subsistence economy, where kind of just being able to be sure that one was going to be able to survive, that everyday vulnerability was something that became very, very apparent to me when I was doing the translation of the Therigatha, which are the poems of the first Buddhist women who lived in the lifetime of the Buddha. And it is a text which survives in Pali. Let me just say a few things about the Therigatha. Is that what seems to be the case is that the collection of poems of these women are among the earliest women's writing that we have anywhere in the world, and that they are some of the earliest literary poetry that we have for South Asia itself, so that we can distinguish it as something of almost like secular poetry, as it composed to the poetry that we see in Vedic literature that is clearly earlier than anything that we have in Pali. One of the things to just say about the Therigatha is that what the poems, which are all in the first person voice of women, that what they routinely draw attention to is the everyday suffering of women living in a society that oftentimes was kind of indifferent to or opposed to the aspirations or the desires of women themselves. So one of the things that we see in the Therigatha is this everyday suffering, everyday oppression that women encountered in their lives at the time that the poems were composed. So let me just read one of them, which is actually one of my favorite poems in the whole collection. It's by a woman named Chanda. And what you'll see about it is what she's describing is what happened to her after her both her husband and her children died at a time of famine and illness. So she said, this is the poem. In the past, I was poor, a widow, without children, without friends or relatives. I did not get food or clothing. Taking a bowl and a stick, I went begging from family to family. I wandered for 7 years, tormented by cold and heat. Then I saw a nun as she was receiving food and drink. Approaching her, I said, "Make me go forth to homelessness." And she was sympathetic to me, and Patachara made me go forth. She gave me advice and pointed me toward the highest goal. I listened to her words, and I put into action her advice. That excellent woman's advice was not empty. I know the 3 things that most don't know. Nothing fouls my heart. Let me just say a few things about the poem that stand out for me. One is that the poem just takes, without really having to highlight in any way, just the reality of what would happen to a woman who became, let's say, on her own, without other members of an extended family to help her to survive. So it begins that she was poor and a widow without children and without friends or relatives. And then the conclusion is that she didn't have anything to eat or any clothing. It ends up that she's living on the street. She's begging. And that for 7 years, she lives outside, just trying to survive by begging food from anyone that she sees. Emphasize, that what she says, I went begging from family to family. And so the contrast between the people that she's begging from, who depend on the mutual support of members of a family, that she's someone without a family. She sees a Buddhist nun then, who is also begging for food, which at that time is the way that Buddhist monastics supported themselves. It was part of monastic practice to collect alms each day. There's a way that when we can read into the poem that when she sees this Buddhist nun getting food, that she didn't have any trouble getting food from people, whereas Chanda, we can imagine, probably did. That maybe the thought that Chanda had was that when she saw this Buddhist nun getting food, that to put it in a very kind of crude way, that Chanda thought about her. She has a better kind of scam. She has a better way of presenting herself than I do. So she approaches the nun and says, teach me what you know. Teach me how to get food the way you do. There's a kind of double meaning in the poem when she goes up to her and says, make me go forth to homelessness. Homelessness is one of the names in Pali for the monastic life. But we can say the irony of this is that at the time when Chanda asked for this Buddhist nun to help her, she is homeless. But she asked her, make me go forth to homeless, make me become homeless. And this kind of very, for me, wondrous moment when she says, oh, this Buddhist nun who was a stranger to her was sympathetic. And then she names her Patachara and says that she ordained her, and then something happened to her religiously. For me, reading it, though, what is kind of part of the beauty of the poem is just the straightforward manner in which it simply assumes the lives of vulnerable people in subsistence economies. And that part of what we enjoy about the poem is the kind of the straightforwardness with which it depicts social realities, the vulnerabilities that come with them, and also the way that it celebrates what I would call the kindness of strangers. That how in subsistence economies, people often rely upon the kindness of strangers, of when people are begging or counting on strangers to help each other in terms of meeting the challenges that human vulnerabilities bring to us. The woman Patachara that's named here, that is someone who has a poem herself in the poems of the first Buddhist women, the Therigatha. And what the organization of the text helps us to see is that Patachara and Chanda all belong to a community of women whose children had died. And so what we see is that what you have in the Therigatha, again, is another recognition of human vulnerability that comes from the precariousness of life, that what can happen to a parent when children die or other family members die. And so what the Therigatha have included within it is, yes, attention to Buddhist ideas and Buddhist practices, but they also have just this stark kind of depiction of, say, the social realities that women face at this time. But also, what we can also point out is that the Therigatha are constantly drawing attention to the vulnerabilities of poor people, that people who are vulnerable simply because of the scarcity of resources that they face. Now, one of the things to just comment that this, just the ordinary depiction of everyday vulnerabilities of people who are oppressed because of their gender or disadvantaged because of their poverty, or made the Therigatha, the poems of the first Buddhist women, to become particularly attractive to modern readers in the 20th century in India, particularly among people of oppressed castes, what some people now today refer to as Dalits. This is a kind of a curiosity of the history of the Therigatha, that as a text, because we can see that in the long history of the Theravada Buddhist world that was using and preserving texts in Pali, this one book of the poems of the first Buddhist women became relatively forgotten, that most people, most scholars didn't give it much attention. And if we look at, we say, oh, the significance of texts can be told by how many times people are quoting them or making allusions to them, that for centuries we can be relatively sure that hardly anyone was reading or paying attention to the Therigatha as a text in the Theravada Buddhist world. This may have been because of the historical fact that the community of ordained Buddhist women, of Buddhist nuns, that disappeared in the Buddhist world around the 12th century or 13th century of the Common Era. So we could just say, oh, the text fell into neglect and then eventually was uh, forgotten, was simply because people were looking for, say, models of how an ordained woman could could live. And once the ordination of women disappeared, people thought, oh, there's no reason to look at this text anymore. In the 20th century in South Asia, with social reformers, people concerned with social inequalities and social oppressions, there's a way in which the Therigatha rose to the surface, and you have all kinds of important uh, figures in 20th century India that turned to the Therigatha as a source of inspiration and guidance, including Rahul Sakratyayan, one of the great writers and Buddhist thinkers of 20th century India. What I want to turn to now is something that the invitation to address you this morning gave me a chance to reflect upon, is the vulnerability of translating forgotten texts in vulnerable languages. So my translation of the Therigatha appears in the Murti series of the Murti Library of Classical Literature of India. And the idea for me to translate the Therigatha for that library, the Murti Library, actually wasn't my idea at all. The series general editor at that time, Sheldon Pollock, when he was thinking about the texts that he wanted to have included in the first 5 volumes released within the series, he wanted to have texts that were, we might say, not just Sanskrit, but representative of all of the literary languages that have been used historically in South Asia. So within the first 5 volumes, you had texts that were in Sanskrit, but also ones that were in Persian, and then in Telugu. And then the inclusion of Pali was, in some sense, to kind of remind us that Pali once was one of the great scholastic translocal languages of South Asia, even though it fell into disuse in medieval times and is now largely forgotten, except in small, limited circumstances in India, even though it remains extremely prominent and visible in Sri Lanka. When I agreed to do the translation, my initial impulse was to translate it the way that most people translate texts of ancient languages, in the method that people refer to as philologically. And we have a great monument of scholarship, of Pali scholarship on the Therigatha, on the philological translation, and especially the philological notes by the English scholar K.R. Norman. One of the things that happened to me, however, when I was preparing myself to think about how to begin to translate these poems of the first Buddhist women, is that for some reason, I can't say that it was particularly considered, I decided to read the translation of the Therigatha into modern Sinhala by a novelist named Martin Wickramasinghe, who was one of the great literary figures of 20th century Sri Lanka. He is, people would say, oh, who is the most important novelist of 20th century Sri Lanka? Almost everyone would say Martin Wickramasinghe. If someone would say who is one of the greatest cultural critics, cultural thinkers of 20th century Sri Lanka, almost everyone would also say Martin Wickramasinghe. In his introduction to this translation, Wickramasinghe makes a number of important points. And one of the things that he emphasizes is that he felt that the power of the ideas, the sentiments, the feelings in the Therigatha could be conveyed in translation, and that you didn't have to read them in the original language alone in order to experience them properly. He makes reference to the fact that the power of the poems of the first Buddhist women to exist to be conveyed in translation by making reference to a scholar, some English reader in Oxford, who read a translation of the Therigatha in German and had a kind of a very important kind of emotional, intellectual reaction to what they were saying. So Wickramasinghe took this as a sign that the Therigatha, that something important about the Therigatha could be conveyed in translation, and that one didn't have to learn Pali to read them, to appreciate them, that reading them in Pali was not necessary, that translation itself was an important vehicle for kind of re-encountering a forgotten text in a vulnerable language. So one of the things when I read Wickramasinghe's own translations, one of the things that I was really quite struck by was just how powerful the translations were. They were very far from what I would call a philological translation, that they were not concerned with trying to reproduce, say, something of the Pali in Sinhala, but that he was more or less driving into the Pali and then expressing what he felt was important about it in contemporary Sinhala. The Sinhala that he used was very experimental too. That Sinhala as a language, the literary culture of Sinhala tended that its literature, its poetry was usually in meters and oftentimes with meters and rhymes. But what Wickramasinghe used was a kind of free verse, which was one of the earliest examples of any writer using that form of poetry in the Sinhala language. But one of the things that happened to me reading Wickramasinghe's translation into Sinhala of the Pali was that it gave me a different model for how translation of a text in an ancient language could work. That it wasn't only about trying to perceive the meanings of words in this vulnerable language, this ancient language, historically, to reconstruct what the meanings of the words were by comparing them to other texts in Pali and in other South Asian languages from the time. But it was also, in some sense, to kind of bring the text into our present, to allow it to speak to us in the ways that for us to hear things that we may not have heard before. Wickramasinghe's kind of careful translation, the power of it, and then also his reflections on what he was doing, gave me a chance to reflect on just how important translation itself may be for the survival of the appreciation of texts in ancient languages, forgotten texts in vulnerable languages, in which we see that it's not only a question of preserving the opportunities for people to learn these ancient languages or these vulnerable languages. It's also a reminder for us to keep on producing translations, to read translations, to encounter the text through the translations themselves. It's also a reminder to us that in translations, what happens is that we have two texts. So in my case, a text existing in Pali, and then my translation existing in American English. we have two texts that by existing at once in different languages are the same, yet obviously different. That kind of phenomenon in which we're experiencing a text that exists in two languages, even when we are only reading one of those languages, seeing them that they are somehow the same, yet obviously different, I think has an analog in terms of how, like the empathy between people, particularly between one person and a person who is vulnerable, in which we see that the empathy that can occur, where we feel a need to respond to the needs of a person in a very vulnerable position, that this is part of the power of the Therigatha, that in reading them, we have a great deal of empathy for the women and the oppressed people that are depicted in the poems, in which that empathy, in a certain sense, turns our attention to the needs and the vulnerabilities of people in our own world. But the last thing I just want to conclude with is to draw your attention to another kind of set of forgotten texts that exists in relationship to the forgotten text of a vulnerable language like Pali. One of the curiosities for me that I learned about in doing the translation of the Therigatha is the range of translations of the Therigatha and other Pali texts into Indian literary languages in the 19th century. And that you have translations into Bengali, translations into a whole range of other texts of, and what people have told me in particular about the Bengali translations done in the 19th century, not by people in universities, but just by learned writers who somehow got access to the Pali texts, that these texts are of considerable literary value. But we can also say that they were produced, these literary translations were produced not for academic purposes or for the preservation of forgotten texts in ancient languages, but because of people finding them somehow speaking to contemporary conditions in India at the end of the 19th century. I myself think that these literary translations in a whole range of Indian languages, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Hindi, Urdu, Marathi, of Pali texts are today relatively forgotten, in part because they are not thought of as being academic translations, or that people may prefer to read the translations of early Buddhist texts in Pali in terms of the contemporary translocal language of English. But it strikes me that some kind of recovery of these forgotten texts, these forgotten translations in modern Indian languages, done in the 19th century, early 20th century, by a whole variety of authors across South Asia, are another resource for us for learning about how people encountering the forgotten texts in vulnerable languages were also cultivating sensibilities towards the plight of vulnerable people in precarious times. So with that, let me stop and turn to see if people have comments or questions that they would like to ask.
Roy, Matthew, thank you, Professor Hallisey, for that wonderful talk. Should we invite questions from the audience, if you wouldn't mind?
Yes, please. I would welcome all comments or questions, suggestions.
Yeah,
And I think that
sure.
I saw
Roy,
that
please,
someone had
please
raised
go.
their hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead,
Professor
Roy.
Hallisey, thank you for the lecture. You had mentioned that Pali, even though that Pali is still significant in Sri Lanka, and in an academic text about the consumption of illicit liquor in Sri Lanka, it points out that the people who consume liquor, which is a significant percent of the population, they have playfully changed the fifth precept of Buddhism. The precept originally reads, "Do not take even a little bit of an intoxicating substance." And they have changed, as in they have playfully changed the interpretation to taking alcohol to a medium level will be most beautiful. So I feel that even though the interpretation has been changed to suit convenience, I feel that the fact that they had to do it in Pali and not in English or not in any other language, that they still showed some some respect for the original. Doesn't it show that Pali is still given some sort of regard? At least the teachings that were originally written in Pali, including the 5 precepts, are still given some sort of regard, despite it not being extant.
Yeah. So you're right that in a country like Sri Lanka, the prestige of Pali continues. And that prestige shows up in everyday life, in which people will know kind of expressions in Pali, particularly things like the 5 precepts that you just mentioned, various kinds of ritual statements that people will have. Oftentimes people will know words that are Pali words, and they will use them in their everyday English, everyday Sinhala. And what you're saying is that, putting kind of contemporary behavior, like the consumption of alcohol, and then kind of with what you could say almost in a tongue-in-cheek way of converting that kind of a medium amount of use of alcohol is a beautiful thing. That kind of tongue-in-cheek, humorous way of putting it, but putting it in Pali, is a way in which the continuing use of kind of the prestige of the Pali as a language continues. What you might have would be is that the decline of Pali would be is that relatively few people would feel comfortable in reading like the vast majority, the whole library of books that are written in Pali today. But you're right to say, the prestige continues, even when the learning of Pali is, in some sense, not as prominent as it once was.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, please.
Professor Hallisey, I was wondering if, what impact did the rise of print culture in, say, the late 18th or the early 19th century in the Indian subcontinent, what impact did it have on Pali as a language? As in, why did it fail to make Pali a language of everyday currency, unlike, say, modern Indian languages such as Bengali or Marathi or Malayalam or Tamil? Did it fail in making, what impact did print culture have on Pali as a language?
This is, it's a wonderful question as well. And one of the things that, just historically, you would say is that Pali existed in Buddhist societies, always in a context where more than one language was being used. So that you would have the circulation of texts in Pali, the study of Pali, people using Pali for thinking, for expressing themselves. But side by side with that would be the use of some kind of local language, Thai, Burmese, Sinhala, and so on. What happened with print culture would be is that when we look in the 19th century at the first Buddhist books that were printed in Sri Lanka, that what you see is that the texts that were chosen to be put into print were oftentimes bilingual, in which they were both Pali and Sinhala at the same time. And so they were texts that might say were commentarial, that were helping to give access to people by more or less almost like word by word, line by line translations of the Pali that was there. So when we look at say for the first few decades of the publication in print culture of Pali texts, almost all of them were in these bilingual editions. You also had the publication of texts that were only in Pali, that were part of, say, a social world of kind of giving like important books as gifts to monks to sustain their own practices. And I think that the other thing that happened is that when European scholars began to want to learn about Pali as a way of trying to learn about early Buddhism, and their emphasis on early texts, particularly canonical texts, that they began to publish only the early texts and not the later commentarial texts or the received heritage of Pali. And so the emphasis on the early texts and divided away from like the continuing reception of Pali had an impact in which Pali became something of what the colloquial English expression would be something like a dead language, that it was studied as a way that in the same way that Europeans studied ancient Greek or Latin. And so it was understood on the model of those things. And so that combination of things, of it turned towards the emphasis on early texts and a neglect of later texts, and then also the separation of printing of Pali from texts in local languages. I think all combined to make Pali less of a kind of a learning language of everyday use, such that it was vulnerable to being displaced by a language like English.
Thank you so much.
In the space while people may be formulating another question, I just want to kind of emphasize perhaps to people in the audience and their own interest that maybe that in Pali, story literature that survives in Pali may be a great resource for the historical study of human vulnerability in the past. Insofar as what I mentioned, that this story literature has a kind of frankness and starkness in the manner that it represents the kind of the challenges and the precariousness of human life and subsistence economies, and such that what the things that we see is how like people reacted to each other's kind of sufferings and vulnerabilities, but also that it is something of quite oftentimes we might say quite inspirational to us, where we see the generosity, the empathy of people reacting to other people who are kind of suffering a great deal because of things that have happened to them of no fault of their own within these kind of precarious circumstances.
Abdul, I have something to. Hello.
Hello.
Professor Hallisey, that was wonderful. What you did was you weren't actually talking specific text as much as opening up a world. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I was just thinking of the parallels you were drawing between subsistence economies, the lives of women, and specific classes of people then and now. And thereby, you are actually also talking about how one can read ancient texts into the present and vice versa. So that I thought was particularly illuminating, especially for us who this is literally a closed book. And I was also struck by the rigor of your method of historicizing it, which you just iterated again in your concluding a few minutes ago, that I thought the rigor of bringing in the history and the historicity of those texts enabled us to make them speak to us, which I thought was good because I thought the challenge was how one reads contemporary vulnerability backwards in time, and you demonstrated that, though the contexts are different. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about it, that they are the context of vulnerability are similar. And what you did was to show us those parallels within those texts. I'm very grateful to you for showing us an approach and showing us a specific research method as well in that. So thank you so much. That was thoroughly enjoyable. Atul, anybody else, please check.
Yes, if there are more questions, comments of Professor Hallisey, could be questions, comments.
Can I just respond to something that Professor Nair just said? I appreciate very much his comment, and really exactly what I was hoping to convey. And that is the sense that quite often when we read polytexts, we think we're only engaged in a historical reconstruction of what they meant in their own time in the past. But my own experience reading them is that, even with careful historical attention, what can happen is that they begin to speak to us in our time as well, and they teach us possibilities and give us reminders of things that continue, but also that they just turn our attention to things that we may not be thinking about today, and that actually they turn out to be considerable resources for our own time, which is really, as we all know, defined by a great deal of human precariousness.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Hallisey. And if there are no more questions and comments, we could perhaps have a formal vote of thanks by our project assistant, Dr. Meenakshi Srihari.
Thanks, Atul. I would like to now propose a formal vote of thanks. My first thanks is, of course, to Professor Charles Hallisey, who patiently took us through various examples from Pali poetry that illustrate different states of vulnerability and social realities, elaborating especially on the theme of everyday suffering that is across different poems from Terigata. Thank you also for your thoughts on the vulnerabilities embedded in the act of translation itself by walking us through your own experiences translating and reading other translations, and for beautifully this theme of vulnerable languages and forgotten texts in your talk. Thank you also for engaging with the audience and responding to all our questions in a very accessible way. I would next like to thank Mukti Classical Library and Harvard University Press for facilitating this session and helping us meet Professor Hallisey. Thank you, of course, to Professors Anna Kurian and Professor Pramod K. Nair for organizing this wonderful series that has helped us be exposed to several different forms of reading vulnerability across various texts and various cultural contexts. Thank you everybody who has turned up today, and thank you to everybody in the audience who asked your questions. And again, a short announcement: our next lecture in the Citing Vulnerability series will be held on the 8th of November. So we hope to see all of you there as well on the 8th. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hallisey.
Thank you.